Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hearthstone video. So today what we're going to do is do a new deck overview on my mid-range Shaman. Now, with Shaman decks these days, there's not a lot that's sort of original, right? Shaman decks by and large consist of the same core of maybe 20 or so cards. So any variation outside of it is minimal, and I'm sure that what I've put together here, I built pretty much from the ground up. I mean, I've looked around online to see what other people have done, but this is pretty much my own. That said, though, I'm sure it isn't 100% original. I'm sure that somebody else has come up with something quite similar. But I thought that I would explain why I've got the cards in here that I have, and why it works so effectively. In general, this has done quite well for me. Right now I'm ranked 6 on the NA ladder, and it's done quite well for me in beating the Miracle Rogues that everybody sort of is despising these days. I actually have a fairly good win rate against them, and it's quite good. It has the tools to deal with basically everything else, including aggro and including control. So let's talk about what the cards are and what the purpose is and how it works. So the purpose of the deck essentially is, it is in essence, I've called it mid-range, but it's actually more of sort of a tempo idea. You want to put a bunch of cards on the table, you want to sort of snowball up, and in doing so you have a lot of tools by which to deal with everything. So when it comes to early minions, you have one Argent Squire, and the reasons why it's only one, I'll talk about in a little bit. There's one Argent Squire, you have Acidic Swamp Oozes, 2 of them, you have Feral Spirits early on, you have Unbound Elementals, Defenders to capitalize on the board presence you will almost certainly have, and an Azure Drakes, an Auctioneer, and a Commander to round it all out, as well as the Fire Elementals, of course. Your win condition is essentially using this lead to chip away at your enemy, knock them down into something reasonable, and then something like Wind Fury Leroy with Rockbiter, preferably, or even Wind Fury Fire Elemental, if he happens to stay on the board. Even better is to put them out with a Flame Tongue. One of the best ways to win with the deck, in my opinion, is if you have a Fire Elemental on the board already, if they so let it survive, putting down a Flame Tongue beside it and a Leroy means that you have 16 damage out of hand, which is very, very nice. If you have Wind Fury, that's 24 damage. If you have something on the table outside of the Fire Elemental, call it a Defender of Argus, call it even a Wolf, let's say it's a 2-3, it can hit for 4, and then you can put the Leroy down beside it, like in between it and the Flame Tongue, and it will benefit from it as well. And so you can just squeeze out all that much more damage. There's only one Flame Tongue in here, so you have to use it wisely if that's how that will work. But otherwise, that's the sort of basic idea of the deck. There's a lot of card draw and cycle. There's no Mana Tide Totem, but there are Azure Drakes and the Gadgetzan Auctioneer. It's pretty rare that I find that I have card issues with the deck, but there are ways you could switch around to remedy that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's go through them. So Earthshock, Lightning Bolt, Rockbiter Weapon, these are all very, very standard cards for Shaman. There's no reason to really talk about them very much. You want to be very careful, particularly in control matchups, with how you use these. Rockbiter to the face is, of course, never something you do, period. This is a removal card unless you're going to win with it. And don't be afraid to use it as removal early on as well. So if you have something like an aggressive deck, a zoo deck for something, you absolutely want to keep Rockbiter in your hand, and you can use your Rockbiter weapon to take out like a Flame Imp or a Knife Juggler. It's quite good for that early on. Lightning Bolts is the same sort of deal. It'd be nice to save it to mid-late game, but of course you can use it to fight aggro early on, and Earthshock as well. Earthshock is so good. It is one of the best cards in the game, in my opinion. It one-shots Twilight Drakes, it one-shots Scarlet Crusaders and Argent Squires. If you have Spell Power, it kills an Argent Commander as well. It's just a really, really spectacular card. You can use it as just a silence, or you can use it to finish something off that's quite threatening. Be sparing with them, but don't be afraid to use them. And if you see something like a Twilight Drake, just take your free creature and be done with it. It's really, really good. It's one of the reasons that our handlock matchup is actually not so bad. We have one Argent Squire in here. A lot of decks that are tempo decks like to run 2, and ditto with 2 Flame Tongues, but I've actually taken out one of each to put in 2 Acidic Swamp Oozes. And the reason for this is because Miracle Rogue, as well as Control Warrior, even Aggro Warrior, and Hunters are all over the place at the moment. Hunters are going away, happily enough, Um, but as to warriors and rogues, they're all the rage at the moment, and having acidic swamp ooze is just something that I think makes a lot of sense. Harrison Jones does not make a lot of sense. In the case of the rogue, the only thing you're really going to benefit from is having the Assassin's Blade out. And a lot of games against Miracle Rogue, you don't even see the Assassin's Blade. Essentially what happens is you get hit with a lot of deadly poisons on their hero daggers. And so the Harrison Jones will draw you a single card if you're lucky, and other times it's just not a very good value if you don't get it. The Ooze is a fine value. It's a 3-2 for 2, it's your average 2-drop, but it can also just destroy a weapon, which is absolutely wonderful, and really all you need. So that's why they're in there. It essentially is how I've traded out the Argent Squires. The Argent Squire is excellent with this deck because of the Flame Tongue Totem. You can get a lot of value, and it's just very tough to remove. It's great for an early tempo card, so I felt it was a good idea to have at least one in there, and whenever I see that in my opening hand, I'm a very happy guy. There's not a lot of other things that I would remove. One potential thing you could do is take out one Acidic Swamp Ooze for an Argent Squire to make it 2, and that's certainly a trade that I would consider, but actually given the meta right now, I actually like having 2 oozes in there. The Stormforged Axe is your anti-aggro card in the beginning. It's 2 attack, which is enough to kill most annoying creatures. Kills Flame Imps, kills Knife Jugglers, all that sort of stuff it's very good against. And the 3 durability is really excellent. You want to try to not use this on turn 2, because it limits you, but then again, it still gives you 2 mana, you can put out a totem, so it's not the end of the world. What you don't usually want to do, though, is coin this out on turn 1, just because the overload does make your next turn a little bit awkward. Wind Fury is a win condition, and that is basically it. You don't want to use this frivolously if you can avoid it. This is essentially what you want to do when you're about to win the game. You have a Fire Elemental on the table, or you have Leroy in the hand, and put it down for 12 damage right away, with no other buffs. This is something that I like very much, the Wind Fury combo. Some decks like this like to run Alakir, and they don't like to run Wind Fury. I actually prefer the Wind Fury Leroy to the Alakir, simply because you can use it much earlier, and you basically are always using Alakir for a finisher anyhow, because Alakir, he has to be a finisher in a lot of ways. He's a lot of mana for what he is, and so why not get him out a lot earlier? You have to spend one more card, but by the same token, I think it's much more worth it. So the Acidic Swamp Ooze, as we've talked about, Bloodmage Thalnos is exquisite in a Shaman deck. It pumps up all of your early game spells, and it pumps up your Lightning Storm. It's just really great value, and of course it gives you a card, which is something that the deck benefits from, not having a Mana Tide totem. One Flame Tongue, as I explained before, I would like 2, but right now, in the current state of the meta, I value the Acidic Swamp Ooze much more than that. It's that simple. I would, if there was no rogue in the meta, and maybe no warrior, then it would be 2 Flame Tongues and 2 Argent Squires. But given what it is, I've decided to trade both in for more 2-drops. The Feral Spirit is, again, completely standard in basically every Shaman deck. There's no real reason to explain this. Great against aggro, great against anything, really, because if it's control, if it's miracle, it puts a lot of pressure on. Coining out Feral Spirits is usually a bad idea, but if you coin it out on turn 2 against something like a Miracle Rogue, the likelihood is actually quite high that you'll be able to capitalize on it and do some level of tempo damage to them and make them sort of spend a lot of cards that they don't want to spend. So even though it's a little bit debilitating, especially if you have one of your many 1-drops in hand, it's actually not a terrible play, but only against the right sort of decks. That's completely suicide against something like a Zoo, in my opinion. You usually want to hold it until turn 3 for that. Hex, brilliant removal. Lightning Storm, brilliant removal. You want to try your best to have spell power on the board for Lightning Storm, but sometimes you don't need it, obviously. And this is just very standard Shaman stuff. The Unbound Elemental, I've got 2 of them in there, because aside from the fact that it can benefit from a lot of your cards, it also is a perfectly legitimate pass the vanilla test 3-drop minion. 2/4 is great. It's difficult to remove. Rogues usually have to blow a combo to Eviscerate to get rid of it, or a Deadly Poison and something else. So it's almost always 2 cards for them, which is wonderful. And against a lot of other things too, it is usually 2 cards to get rid of something with 4 health, especially if you play it right on turn 3, or even coin it out on turn 2. Really excellent combo with the Unbound Elemental, in my experience, is coin turn 2 Unbound into turn 3 Feral Spirit. That's a really, really strong opening, and I'm really happy whenever I can get a chance to do something like that. We've got 2 defenders in here to help you capitalize primarily on your totems. You have a lot of 0-2 minions, and the defender makes them into 1-3s, which actually can be quite useful. The other thing, of course, is that the defender is actually great with anything, right? It works well with the Unbound, it works well with the Azure Drakes, it works well with Leroy to squeeze the extra damage out there. Turn 10, Defender Leroy Wind Fury gives you 14 damage instead of 12, which can actually make the difference sometimes. So I like the Defender quite a bit, and very rarely with this deck will you not be able to use it to its fullest extent. That's usually the worry with something like the Defender, is that you'll not be able to capitalize on its value, but in this deck you probably will, and if you can't, you're probably going to lose. This deck really does rely on having some amount of board presence, so this helps a lot. The Leroy we've talked about, that's your finisher. The Azure Drakes are just great Shaman cards again. You have wonderful spell power, really benefits Shaman, and its card draw, which is spectacular. Plus it's not a bad minion in its own right with the 4/4 body. The Azure Drake and Thalnos, I think, are actually some of the strongest in the Shaman deck, just because things like Lightning Bolt, Earth Shock, the Lightning Storm, all of these things benefit from it immensely, and it really makes a difference in clutch positions. The Auctioneer is there for card draw. I feel like every deck, almost every deck these days, is trying to do some sort of a variant of the Miracle Rogue because it's working so well. This is not by any means a Miracle Shaman or anything like this. The Auctioneer is there because it's the same as the Azure Drake, and you have a lot of spells. You have Feral Spirits and Hexes, and all of these 3 guys at the beginning, the Earthshock, Lightning Bolt, Rockbiter, almost half of your deck is spells. And so it only makes sense to have something like this in there that you can capitalize on later in the game. It's important to understand too that as long as you get 1 card out of him, he's actually got his sort of value, his vanilla test value. So don't be afraid to only play him with 1 other thing. If you have more, bonus, but you don't need to get too greedy with your Auctioneer. The Argent Commander and the Fire Elementals are your end game combos as well. You don't need Leroy to win, especially if you've been chipping down their health over time. The Argent Commander can win games for you, as can the Fire Elemental. The Argent Commander is not as good as the Fire Elemental or Leroy for sort of doing endgame damage, but sometimes you just sort of need a big body on the board, right? You just need a Divine Shield minion that you can use to remove something. This is great against something like an Azure Drake or an Auctioneer, for that matter. And so it's really nice to be able to just remove something and still have a body on the board. And of course, if you throw down the commander with Rockbiter and Wind Fury, it's still 14 damage. It's not as efficient as something like Leroy, because that would be 18 damage with Leroy, but it's still 14 damage and can still burst someone down very quickly and very unexpectedly. And of course, the Fire Elementals are just excellent cards. If they survive for even a turn, they can do a lot of really awful things to your enemy. I don't have any big finishers like Rag or Ysera or anything like that, because this is supposed to be a tempo deck in a lot of ways. This is a very fast-paced, snowballing sort of a thing, and 8 drops, 9 drops, that sort of thing, they're too slow, essentially. Which is another reason why I don't actually like Alakir in this deck. And so, let's talk a little bit about, now, some potential replacements, why I don't have some cards in there. So, some people in their Shaman decks lately have been running Forked Lightning. I don't like this at all. It's 1 mana with a 2 overload, and against something like the Zoo, it's effective, but you're going to be tempted to play this early, and it will cripple you early. And so, I don't actually like Forked Lightning at all for dealing with anti-aggro, especially when you have things like Lightning Storm in hand. So I think it's not terrible if the entire meta was nothing but aggro, but the other thing, of course, is that right now, the meta is actually shifting to be more mid-range control-oriented, so this is just completely unnecessary in my opinion. Another thing that we don't have in here is Lava Bursts. They are good utility removal, they work well with the Auctioneer, they work well with the spell power that we have in the deck. Lava Burst is a nice card, but by the same token I don't think we need it. It's that simple. I just don't think that we need the extra 5 damage, and I think that the way the deck is with sort of a more of a creature focus, more of a board focus, we don't need the extra out-of-hand damage to make either effective removal or effective killing power either. Now the big one, the really big one, I think, is the Manatide Totem. We don't have Manatide Totem in there because, again, it's just too slow, as far as I'm concerned. If you wanted to put one in desperately, if you find that your card draw is not where you want it to be, take out one Ooze and put it in. But I actually don't like it. I think that it's good. It's like a better Nat Pagal, for instance. But I just don't think that having... And to be fair, it also will guarantee you a turn 3 draw. Or rather, it will always draw one card. But the likelihood that it will stick around for longer is pretty weak. If it survives for a long time, you have a lot of value, but the chances it will are low, which means that you're probably paying 3 mana for one card, and it's only going to replace itself, so I don't actually think that's worth it at the end of the day. I would rather have something in there that's more valuable and stands more on its own. So that's essentially my logic for not having the Manatide Totem in there. The Doomhammer is not good in the current meta. It just isn't. The problem with it, essentially, is that with all these Miracle Rogues and Warriors running around, decks like mine are going to be running a lot more Acidic Swamp Oozes, which means that the Doomhammer is going to get killed. And the Doomhammer having 8 mana, or 8 durability, it will really suck when that goes away. It's 7 mana for essentially what will be 2 hits. So that's not very good. Also, with Harrison Jones flying around, some people run it, I don't like it, but a lot of people do. If he actually catches this, if you're so lucky to have that happen, he will get 6 cards. 6 cards for the enemy, if he does it right on the first turn. So, and since he has many turns to do it, the likelihood is very high that you will get really killed if someone does that. The other thing, too, is that it is going to kill yourself, right? Mostly we use Doomhammer for removal of the board, and your creatures and your spells are going to be doing that. You, as a shaman, don't have any healing, which is a little bit ridiculous, but still true. And as a result, if you're removing things with the Doomhammer, especially against something like rogues or warriors, you're just going to be putting yourself into lethal range faster. And so I actually dislike it for that reason too. That argument I could see the opposite side of, but the argument that it will just get killed by an Ooze or Harrison, I think is a much stronger argument. No Bloodlust, even though this is a tempo deck and sort of you want to snowball a board, simply because your win condition is a Shadow Step, that's funny, is a Wind Fury Leroy, and there's no reason to have Bloodlust in there as well. You usually pick one, and I find that this is more reliable because you need 2 cards and you can do it out of hand, whereas Bloodlust you actually need board presence to make it work. And the Earth Elemental is not there because these days Black Knight is floating around, lots more people are running Silences. The Earth Elemental is a big risk. It's excellent when it happens, but for 3 overload, especially if you play it on turn 5, that's a killer. It just is not something that is effective, I think, and the chances of it going bad are much, much higher than the chances of it going well, I think. So it's too risky for me. And in a deck like this, even though it would be helpful to sort of snowball that board lead, I don't actually think it is more valuable than any of the 5-drops and any of the cards in general toward the late game. So those are the big sort of, those are the ones you would expect. I don't have Alec here, but I wouldn't put him in even if I did have him. You also, this is sort of goes without saying, I guess, but you don't want the Wind Speaker instead of Wind Fury, because even though it is a minion, it's too slow, essentially. You can do Wind Fury Leroy for 6, and do 12 damage on turn 6 in addition to the rest of your board, which is great if you happen to have board control and you're rushing someone down. This takes till turn 8, so that's not especially effective. And against the Argent Commander, it takes turn 10. Wind Fury is just more modular. It's easier to do. So that's the basic premise behind the deck. That's the basic cards and why I've included those ones over other things. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. But otherwise, try this deck out. It's great, I think, in the current meta. It has a lot of tools to deal with a lot of things. Really good against control, really good against aggro, and has a fair matchup against basically everything. The hardest matchup for this deck is the Hunter, but because Unleash the Hounds was nerfed very, very recently, the likelihood that you're going to see a lot of Hunters, especially in the next week or two, is going to be pretty low. As with any nerf, the community is going to overreact almost assuredly and drop everything that they ever had to do with Hunters, even though the mana cost is only a little bit more. I think a lot of people are going to just think that Hunters are ruined forever now, and they'll fix themselves and think about it a little bit more thoroughly in a couple of weeks, but for right now, Hunters are going to see quite an all-time low, I would think. And so as a result, the Shaman, which is normally countered quite hard by the Hunter, I think can have a good rise for a little while. It's going to get quite strong. So in any case, thanks so much for watching, guys. Give it a try on the ladder, see what you think, and I'll talk to you guys next time.